I just want to take a moment to wish Empire Strikes Back a happy 45th anniversary, and for going from one of the most controversial entries in Star Wars to one of the greatest films ever made. With that in mind, I do think I have a model for us to work on today. Okay. Yang, you want to help me with this?
Let's see what we have. Let me see. No. Ah, I wondered where I put that. Oh, that's not mine. What do we have here?
Thanks to Yang, we now have a Luke model. It may not be the Empire Strikes Back one, but it's still Luke. First thing we got to do, take care of the pesky mold lines. So what I do is I usually just take my hobby knife, but you can use a mold line scraper, whatever the case might be. You want to get all these mold lines right here. You want to get some in the folds of the model, but you want to be very careful doing that. You want to be very gentle as you scrape the mold lines away because you don't want to get into detail. Try not to do what I do and carve. It's not always the best option. As for priming, we have a matte black primer. Doesn't matter which, you can use spray can, whatever you have on hand. Any black primer is going to be the base for what we're doing right now. So one thing that I do is I mark the model on the feet and I put a lot of paint, like a bright colored paint, on the feet of the model and press it down to the model. And what that does is it gives me an indication of where the model is going to stand on the base. So what I use for basing is it varies from model to model. For this model, we're going to use Sterling Mud from Citadel, but you can use any texture-based paint that does mud effects because we're just looking for a dark brown mud. Another thing that you have to be careful with is using a used brush. So what you want to do is take an old brush that you have, dip it into the material, and put some gloves onto the base and just start moving it around. Again, avoiding where the feet are going to go because you want the model to be glued to the base and not the basing material itself. Plus, you just don't want the technical paint to just rip off the base because it glued to the technical paint instead of the base itself. So just be careful with this step. Just make sure you're putting it all over the model base, but at the same time, avoiding those areas where you would be gluing the model to the base. So for this model, I'm going to be using the sticky tack with the painting handle method. You could also pin it to a piece of cork. It's a little bit more complicated. Plus, anybody can grab a shot glass or a bottle or anything that's painting handle like and stick the model to the painting handle with sticky tack. And you want to make sure that it doesn't do that. And you want to press hard and make sure that it adheres to your handle, whatever you might be using, before you start painting. Because if you're in the middle of painting and it drops like it did a second ago, it's going to ruin your paint job, potentially. Let's say falling in paint, not good. For this first phase, we're going to be putting the base colors down for the cloth, and it's going to wind up being a slightly brighter tannish brown color in the end. But for now, you want to go over all of that cloth with this dark umber color so that you can make sure that you have good dark brown shadows to work from. And that's the whole point of painting this way, is going down with the darkest color in whatever color range you're using and building up slowly through the lighter colors. So it gives this nice smooth blend, but we'll get into that later. For now, don't worry about being messy. If you get any on the face or you get any on the hands or you get any on any other part of the model, trust me, we can go over that later with the main color of the skin or the belt or whatever that may be. So be as messy as you want in this first phase because we are wanting full coverage on this brown color. And at this point, you may notice too that that black color that we started with the primer is actually helping with the shading and making the shadows look darker than if we started with a gray or a white primer. For the first layer, I'm going to be using light umber at about a 60-40 mix of the dark to light color. You want the darker mix so that it blends better with the previous layer while also allowing for the lighter colors to blend better too later on. You want to get about 70% of the layer over the base layer. And as you can see here, the shadows kind of get darker as you build this up. For the mid-tone to the higher highlight layers, I'm adding some red gray to the palette to take a little bit of it and mix it. Just like last time with the previous layer, we want to get a darker color at first and then blend in more and more of the light color as we go around to the lighter colors. What you want to do is focus on about 40% of the surface, leaving the darker sections alone so they contrast with the lighter colors we were adding. And you want to get a smooth blend going with the mid dark to light dark, and so on and so forth with the higher highlights. Once you get to the extremely bright colors and layers, you want to do full on red gray. And I only want to hit maybe about 10 to 20% of the surface edges. Some places, even less, just depends on how much detail there is on the surfaces that you're painting. And you want to end on this red gray highlight. And one thing I noticed after finishing these layers is that I probably should have kept going lighter and lighter, and you'll see later on. But this is trial and error, and you'll learn as you go how much lighter you actually need to make the model. And if you don't like it, you can always go back over it. Moving on to the skin, I use burnt red for the base, and there's a reason that red base skin tones come out really well for a Caucasian style skin tone that we're going for. As you build the layers on top of it, they keep this reddish hue, which essentially creates the illusion of the warmth of the blood flow under the skin. If you think about Santa's rosy cheeks in a way, that's kind of what we're going for, but not to that extreme. Now what I'm going to do is take dark warm flesh, and like with the clothes and the brown colors, I'm going to mix a little bit of red with the flesh tone. And we want it to be more red at first in order to get a good blend established, and also to leave those darker red shadows because they're still going to read as skin colored once we're done. I'm going to slowly keep adding layer after layer on top of the previous to increase the color and highlighting the skin where it needs to be highlighted. Gradually adding more of the flesh tone until I get that good mid flesh tone color that I want. Then I go to the straight flesh tone for these final little highlights on his face. For Luke's hair, we want what would be the base of a dirty blonde kind of color. For this, I went with drab brown, which is just a dark yellowish brown color. We want to be very careful around the skin tones that we already put down because just like the clothes, you'll have to repaint whatever you mess up on your previous work. As I finish up the drab brown, the next color I want to add is a pale yellowish color, so I opted for olive flesh. Like with the skin and clothes, I mix the darker with the lighter, with a bit more darker color in the mix to begin with. Then I highlight a decent majority of the raised hair details on the model with the midtones. Finally, I finish all of that off with a smaller highlight of the olive flesh color to give this dirty blonde look to the hair. And that's the hair finished. For the black hilt of the lightsaber, as well as the belts and the blaster, I went with the color Cold Black, which is a matte black color from Pro Acryl. What we want to do now is we want to get his belts, his holster belt, and his saber parts with this color and be very careful not to get it on the clothing or his hands. If you do, you can just go back and touch it up, but it's always best to try and avoid having to do that. Next, we add dark neutral gray to the palette and mix it with coal black, just like we mixed the other colors. We highlight these parts just like we did before, first with the darker mix, gradually moving on to the straight dark neutral gray. Finally, I take some of the olive flesh and mix it in with the dark neutral gray for the highest highlight color. Next, we'll move on to the metal parts of the model, which there aren't very many of. So I made the decision to go with straight silver, as there aren't too many parts of this model that are silver, and we'll save some time by just going straight to the regular silver color as opposed to highlighting up at this point. For the saber blade, I want a very bold color to come from it. So I used bold titanium white and put a full coverage on this blade to set the stage for what comes next. For the OSL on this model, object source lighting as it's called, we will need a dry brush. You can also do this with an airbrush, but what I wanted to do with this model is show you how to do it with a dry brush. So that way, if you don't have an airbrush, you have a method in which you can use to create object source lighting. It can be a makeup brush, an old brush that has become somewhat fluffy or something like that. You just want a bushy brush that's going to apply the colors on just the raised detail. I'm going to be using my wet palette as both a dampener for the brush as well as for getting some of the paint off before dry brushing. It's often recommended that you dampen the brush a little bit with either a sponge or something to help that paint stick, but you don't want to go straight from the paint to the model. You always want to rub some off to get that faded effect. So what I'll do is I'll dip the brush into the paint, dab it a bit, then kind of lightly brush the palette paper to get a majority of it off while also testing it at the same time. Then I lightly brush the areas that will be lit up by the saber on the model. I don't want to overshadow the original colors. I simply want to give them a sort of a glow effect. So that way the original colors blend in with that source lighting. Before we put everything together, however, we're going to take that base that we were waiting on that's drying over in the corner, and we're going to finish that up before we do assembly so we don't mess up all the work we've done on Luke. We're going to take the original clothing colors, the dark browns to the light browns, and we're going to utilize the same dry brushing technique that we used for the object source lighting on the base of the model for the highlights on the base of the model. We want to go through every one of the brown colors from darkest to lightest until we build up some definition on the muddy setting of the base. Finally, we take our dry brush and get some water from our pot on it. Not too much, just enough to make a wash consistency with our original dark brown color and apply that wash as a wash to the base. What that's going to do is that's going to give that more muddy color and bring down the highlights a little bit so it looks like cohesive mud. Once we finish doing that, we are finally ready to assemble the model. And with that, we have a finished Luke model for our Star Wars Legion. Oh boy, that can't be good.